personally as I walk around the world is that people love to tell their stories. That most of us want to tell a story. Here's another thing that I find. People like to tell a story when there's no fear. Like this guy, I don't know his name. He doesn't know my name. He might be telling his wife this weekend. There was a airport looking on. So I asked him about, whatever, I don't know what he's telling his wife, right? I don't know what's going on there. But I find that people like to tell their stories, and I like to hear people's stories because they're really interesting. And what I found out about this guy is, well, he looked like a biker, he was all tatted up, and he had leather clothes on. He's actually a engineer. He had been in Las Vegas, some sort of engineering company. You find out things about people when you stop for a minute and listen. It's difficult to hate people when you get close to them, isn't it? It's difficult to see people go, oh, yeah, I don't really think I want to talk to you. When you move in close and you get to look in someone's eye and you get to hear their story, you find out that people are interested. And often people want to tell their stories. Everyone has an interesting story. That's my experience. When we think about what it looks like to be a place where people are engaged in authentic relationships, we realize that in an environment where there are authentic relationships, people help each other. And we have an opportunity to hear from each other. For some of us, that's easier than for others. I tend to be fairly open, except there are certain environments I try to stay close because I need to find space. But some people are pretty open. You can sit down and 5 minutes later, you have a whole bunch of stories. Some people you sit for a year and half of their story, and it's not even all of it, right? All the parts that you've got have been exactly right. Because we guard ourselves for philosophy. It's not always easy to tell people. But real and deep emotional relationship happens in an environment where authentic stories can be told, where we can be authentic about who we are. And most like Christian church is at its best. We're at its best. Our best. People grow for us. So, authentic, I really want to focus in on the word authentic. And so I want to start with just the anatomy of authenticity. What does it look like? And this is probably not something that is very surprising to anyone, but when I say authentic, here's what I mean. It's a place where honest seekers are warmly welcome. A place where people can come, where you can be a part of it, and that you can come with the struggles that you're facing, some of the things that you're going through, and some of the victories that you're experiencing, some of the challenges, maybe the places where you feel like your life is better. A place of authenticity is a place where you can come with your actual real story. And you can not have to be afraid that when you tell your actual real story, that you're going to be put off or set aside. The definition of authenticity is simple again. It's not false. It's not imitation. It's actual. It's real. It's genuine. And so when we say that someone is authentic, what do we mean? We mean they are who they say they are. Have you ever noticed that there are some people who they are, you get what you get? Say, we have one son who's this way. You know always how he feels. It's just there, right? And he doesn't have to talk about it. He doesn't have to tell us about it. It's just like you just know it. And we have another son who you never quite know. So, it's interesting, different, but there are certain people that you just know what you're going to get because it's just right out there. Sometimes that's refreshing, isn't it? Sometimes it's a lot. But it's refreshing when you get the real story. People are in front of you, who they are also away from you. So what you see is what you get kind of a thing. The mask has been lowered. We live in a culture that lives with masks. And we do that because we want people to love us or accept us or welcome us. The challenge with that is that it's an insecure place to stand. And here's why. That people that love you love the mask. And when the mask comes off, now you're at risk again. Right? So the problem with living inauthentically is that people fall in love with what they see because they can't necessarily get behind them. And so this idea of being known by others is really significant. It's really important. We have to sort of fight through the challenges. I know Russ was speaking last week about the fact that, you get in a small group, get in a life group, and yeah, it's going to be awkward at first, but it's going to be good. I love it. I watched the sermon online. I went on Saturday, I went back to Alpharetta, Georgia, because I wanted to visit Andy Stanley's church, because Andy Stanley's kind of a big campuses, and I thought, it'd be fun. I got to be there anyway. Let's go early, I'll go. It was a really quirky church. I kind of sat close to the front because I've got the glasses and I don't be able to see him. Didn't matter. He wasn't there. Talk about authenticity, right? We sang these massively loud songs, amazing band, incredible smoke machines, lights, incredible. And then when the band got done, the walls kind of went back and the big screen came down, and there he was. I'm not making that up. It was like a life-size Andy Stanley on the screen. I thought, I don't have to do this when I'm done. I just need a pre-recorder. No, you guys wouldn't even know. I could probably do the same sermon the week I did before. Just actually on the screen. God, I haven't heard this before. Wow, that's really new. That's incredible. But it's just kind of interesting that, when we want to become known, it takes getting in front of it. It takes opening ourselves up. And sometimes we'll talk to them, tell them your story. And be challenged. Some of them tend to be pretty open, able to tell your stories, and some mindful about even as I talk about this. We're not all the same. We're not all going to be the same level of focus. Here's the other thing. Some of us have had really challenges. Guys, I'm honest, I'm not sure who can trust those souls, but who really trust those souls. That's also that it takes a little bit of time to recognize who are trust your story too, and that means we get people who are trusted with other people. You've been in that place after told your story. Really come back to that as that story goes on. We learn, we trust. And part of being authentic in community is that we're a group of people who trust each other. And when I say group of people, you can come because we can't be a church that's just, because a church is a kind of thing. All that can happen is that we can, as individuals, trust it. The place of authenticity is a place where people are free to be open with their questions and their doubts. How often have you had doubts or questions? You feel like I can't tell them. A place where people can be honest and real about their struggles and their triumphs. We live in this place where we kind of judge our insides by other people's outsides. We watch people and we don't go together. I'm not sure if we can talk about our struggles because what will that be about us? We can't promise because we're not making it, not getting it. A place where people can be honest and real about their victories and their celebrations. It's a place where you can talk about the future side of it. You can embrace those victories. We understand that authenticity is something we have to work on. I'm going to quote Brene Brown a few times because probably there's no one else in the culture who's doing more work on this topic. So, by the way, she has a TED Talk. It's not, but I think it might be maybe one of the most viewed TED Talks in the history of the world. So you can watch TED Talks. You haven't seen the TED Talk by Brene Brown. Ability, going to find it. She says this: authenticity is a collection of choices that we have to make every day. It's about the choice to show up and be real, the choice to be honest, the choice to let our true selves be seen. She goes on to say this: imperfections are not inadequacies, they are reminders that we're all in this together. It was really interesting to be in a group of 50, 60 church leaders and pastors and business leaders. And I honestly feel a little bit out of place. Most of the business leaders are there because they've become quite wealthy and they're very successful. And it's like I don't really fit in that world. These are guys that own houses in different islands, things like that. And I don't feel that much at home. But what's fascinating to me is that when you start to get engaged in a conversation, how you find out that people who have a lot more than you, or people who Here to have it all together, when you actually hear their stories, they're just like us. No, and if you come here and have some crazy notion, I have some. I usually tell you I don't, so you're probably not under 30 degrees about that, right? But the reality is we all have stuff. We all go through things. Life gets hard for us. We have challenges. This is awesome. Away from home, trusting care out, son, loving grandmother. I know that's I know what? That close to us. I got to tell you, it's not that exciting. I love it. I didn't think of it. Just stop by. It's like, close to by it. Right? But sometimes we fear kind of that stuff out. We fear putting ourselves in stuff. And anyone who says they don't, really, genuinely, is trying to sell you something. And so as you don't look around right now, because that'd be awkward, but if you were to look around this room, don't squeeze the hand of the person next to you either, but we all got it, right? None of us have got it together. You got stuff. And so living in an environment of authenticity means that we figure out a way to be real about who we are. Because otherwise, we live with these masks, and people fall in love with the mask. And then when the mask falls off, we're really insecure about whether or not we're loved. One of the challenges of being a community that strives to be authentic is that it means we need to learn to accept people as they come to us, not as we wish them to be. That's not always as easy as it sounded right then when I said it. We have to be ready to welcome the stranger, welcome the newcomer, welcome the new information about someone about who someone is or where they've been or what's gone on in their life. To become people that can welcome the stranger, which is just to say to let down the guard a little bit and realize that not everyone looks like you, not everyone talks like you, not everyone comes from where you came from. Jesus was the master at this, as he was the master, let's be honest, of everything. He was amazing at just accepting people as they came to him. Don't you find it interesting as you read the New Testament story, especially the Gospels, about the people who come to Jesus seemingly unafraid? They just come. And he welcomes them, and he has these great conversations with them. We find Jesus in all kinds of life circumstances. Right? We find him in all kinds of life circumstances. And I want to just talk a little bit about Jesus' stories and meeting people where they are. And one of the thoughts that I have about that is this word, there's an African word, sawubona. And the word means, I see you, you're important, and I value you. This is a greeting that we say, I see you, I hear you, you're valuable to me, you matter to me, and it's a way to make another person visible. It's a way to make another person seen. It's a way of saying this: all my attention is with you. I see you, and I allow myself to discover your needs, to see your fears, to identify your mistakes and accept them. I accept you for what you are, and you're a part of me. When we talk about being a part of a church community, what we're saying is we're a part of each other. We welcome each other. We see each other. We hear each other. We're a part of each other. We pay attention to each other. It's so difficult. I'm really working on, one of my goals this year is I'm working through this program, and I'm really trying to become a really good question asker. And I feel like this has never been it's not like I'm awful at it. I'm probably better at it than maybe some people, but I'm not as good at it as I want to be. But do you know how hard it is sometimes to just stay focused on the person right in front of you? You know this, right? And you know when you're with someone who isn't paying attention to you, right? They're looking over their shoulder, looking for something more to talk to. When I see that happening, when I'm in a conversation with someone, it's like I try to get out of the conversation as quickly as possible. I don't want to be in a conversation someone else doesn't want to be in, right? And I really try not to do that, to try to focus on the person who's with me. And it's not that easy because there are a lot of things going on.
Charlotte and I were just talking this morning. I was pretty quiet yesterday, and again, it's been a really interesting week for me. And she said, I feel like you're kind of mad at me. I was like, I'm not. I'm not mad at you at all. There's just a lot of things going on in my mind. And just to have that conversation with her at that moment to say, there are so many things distracting me. It's just I'm struggling right now with that focus. But Sawabona, I see you and I hear you, and I'm with you right now, and I'm nowhere else. I'm with you right now, and I'm nowhere else. This past week, there was a guy at our table, at the table leader, as it turned out, nice guy. I'm saying that because I'm about to say something that I didn't appreciate about him. He had an Apple Watch on. You know what an Apple Watch does? Everything. That's exactly right. It monitors your blood pressure. It gets your phone calls. Every time he got a text, it popped up on his phone. He looked at it and he'd tap it. I was like, I look quite a lot bigger than this guy. There was one moment I was like, okay, I'm going to tear your arm off. If you look at your watch another time, I'm going to tear your arm off and hit you with it. I know it's a slightly violent tendency. I apologize for that, but it's a sermon about authenticity, right? I'm literally sitting there. It's like, huh. If you've got an Apple Watch, I want to invite you to destroy it. Or figure out how not to look at it every time you get a text. It beeps, it vibrates, it texts. As an email comes in, oh, gotta see that. You ever notice how when somebody looks at their phone, how you just desperately want to look at your phone? It's a crazy thing. So this last week, maybe because of the Apple Watch, I started leaving my phone in my room. I just didn't bring it with me. The guy that was leading it, Russ Klein, great guy, said 800 times in the course of the week, make sure that your notifications are off on your phone. And usually about right when he said that, ding, somewhere in the room. They're like, how long does it take to figure this out, right? But when we have this thing going on, we're not paying attention. We're paying attention to lots of things, but not each other. We are so distracted by what's going on around us that we can't focus on each other. And I say that as a person, honestly, who's very distracted. My mind goes lots of directions at once, and it's always moving. But we have to come to the place where we can say, I see you and I hear you. We think about Jesus, and there's 3 stories that I just want to highlight, and I'm not going to spend tons of time in the story, but I want to spend a little bit of time. The first place that we find Jesus is at a wedding in Cana, in John chapter 2. You remember this story? I love this story. We talk about it in lots of different ways, but I love this story. On the 3rd day, John chapter 2, verse 1, on the 3rd day there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus was also invited to the wedding with his disciples. Now, just stop there. I think this is fascinating. Jesus is invited to a wedding with his disciples. Amador, can we see, do we have a slide with some pictures on it there? Or did I cut that one out? Yeah. Okay, when you think about Jesus, like the picture on the top left, is that how you think of him? No, you don't, do you? You think of a serious guy, right? You think of somebody reflective. You think of someone praying. You don't think about Jesus in the way that you see him on the top left-hand side of the screen. I love that picture of Jesus because I think what we've sometimes forgotten is that Jesus was a person. Like, why is Jesus invited to a wedding if he was super religious and no fun? Right? Can you imagine, like, hey, we got to invite, Joseph and Mary. Oh, Jesus guy's got to come. Then he's always talking about religion. Do we got to have him? Yeah, we got to have him. It's a thing. We got to invite him. And so Jesus, is that what you think happened? What was Jesus doing at the wedding? Do you think Jesus danced? Wouldn't it be awful to have to dance with Jesus? You're like, hey, you're stepping on my feet. Sorry, I'm Jesus. Your feet are in the wrong place. Right? What would it be like? You're at this wedding. Jesus is at a wedding and they run out of wine, right? You know the story. I don't want to talk about that too much except to say that there he was. They run out of wine. Jesus makes more wine. Can you imagine like how many wedding invites Jesus got after this? Like, who are we going to invite to the wedding? I don't know who we're inviting, but we got to have that Jesus guy because we run out of wine. He's money. Right? We need him to be there. But imagine, do you ever imagine Jesus at a wedding? Where do you imagine Jesus? I bet you don't imagine him very often at a wedding. That's the first place we find him in the Gospel of John. It's the first story that John tells. It's the first miracle we know about. Now, maybe he made wine earlier. Maybe that's why he got invited. As a kid, he's 12 years old. I don't know. But Jesus is at the wedding, and he seems to be not having a miserable time. He got invited. He brings the disciples. Yeah, I'm coming, but I got to bring my disciples. Is that okay? Yeah, but we might run out of wine. I got that covered. Jesus is at a wedding, and we find him there in this moment of celebration and joy with people. There's hardly any place better than a wedding to find joyful people, right? It's a time of celebration. I mean, one of the funny things about those guys that were in the airports, they're having a great time. They're looking forward to it. They're going to go to the training camp or spring training for baseball, and they're looking forward to the wedding, and it's just going to be a great thing. And there's this build up to it. They were obviously excited. It's a good thing that's going to happen, and we love weddings. Weddings are fun. And that's where we find Jesus. He meets people where they are, and we find him here at a wedding. I want to invite you to think about the fact that Jesus may have actually been having a good time. That he wasn't there as this grumpy old religious guy in the corner. The grumpy religious guys were probably only invited if they had to be. When you have a party, who do you invite? You invite people who are fun, right? If there's a person who's not fun, you try to figure out how not to invite them. They always come, they're such a downer. Right? Jesus, I don't think, was that way. Jesus was someone who engaged in celebration, and he came to the party. And he engaged in the party. And he did what it took to keep the party going, it turns out. But he enters into the celebrations of life with people, and we need to do that. We need to enter into people's celebrations and their joy. And sometimes I feel like we live in a culture that we can't be too joyful about life with people who are having a really hard time. And I get that. We don't want to be throwing things in people's faces, but the reality is we should embrace the joys that are going on in other people's lives, because that's the place where we meet people. The second story I think about is the woman at the well. And we find this just a little further down the road in John chapter 4, verses 1 through 20. Verse 1 through 42, certainly can't read all of that, but remember the story of Jesus and the woman at the well. John chapter 4. Now when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria, so he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, so Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well, and it was about the 6th hour of the day. So it's about noon. A woman from Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria?" This is a great story, and I don't need to spend a lot of time, because even if you aren't familiar with that many Bible stories, you probably know about the woman at the well. The woman at the well comes there at noon because she's got stuff going on in her life that's not making her very acceptable. She's not at the well when everybody else is there. She's there in the middle of the day. That's not when people routinely went to the well. They would go early in the morning and get their water for the day. But she's there in the middle of the day. And she's surprised that Jesus wants to talk to her. How is it that you, a Jew, talk to me, a Samaritan woman? The Jews didn't like the Samaritans. There was a lot of chaos and conflict. They weren't people that got along very well. That's why Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. It's such a bizarre story because the Good Samaritan, who's a Samaritan, actually acts better than all the religious people who should have known how to act in the story. But she's surprised. Jesus, how is it that you, a man and a Jew, talk to me, a Samaritan and a woman? And so he enters into this conversation with his woman. Now, we know that Jesus was a prophet. We know that he knew who she was, and he knew what was going on because he tells her, right? Well, go and get your husband, and let's talk with him some more. Well, I don't have a husband. You're right. You've been married 5 times, and the guy you're with now isn't your husband. So he knows what's going on, and yet here he is. He's having this conversation. And so he says, well, I know who you are, and I know, what's going on in your life. And immediately she says, let's talk about theology. Right? Don't you love that part of the story? Jesus is talking to her, and he says, go get your husband. And she says, well, I don't have a husband. You're right in saying that. And then the woman said to him, sir, I perceive that you're a prophet. She didn't have to have great powers of perception here, because he tells her about her life as she's there. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship. And Jesus said, listen, here's the thing. Worship wherever you want, on whatever mountain you want, because God's everywhere, because he's spirit. But the point here is that Jesus enters into conversation, dialogue with a woman that he probably, in terms of what was going on in the culture, shouldn't have been talking to. His disciples come back, and they're really surprised that he's talking to her. They don't get it. But he's entered into this conversation with this outcast woman who's from an outcast village, and she's outcast from her people in that village. But he enters into the conversation with her. It's important to recognize that Jesus was there in the midst of this woman's pain and sorrow and broken life. And I wonder, I do this a lot, and partly because, again, I mentioned to you earlier, my mind is always going a lot of places. But when I read Bible stories, I actually try to think of what might have been like in the background. Do you ever do that? You should. It doesn't hurt the text. So I wonder about things like this. When was the last time this woman had somebody actually have a conversation with her when she felt heard? She was at the well in the middle of the day by herself. When was the last time somebody looked at her and saw her and heard her and paid attention to her in the messed up state that her life was in? It's a remarkable story. What's really remarkable about the story is she goes back to the village and tells everyone, guys, I got some information. I think the Messiah is out at the well. You should come. And the end of the story is this, that many people believed because of her testimony. That's odd too. Nobody believed the testimony of a woman in that time. I mean, it's just that's just a fact of the case. It just wasn't, it was an odd thing. There was certain weighty matters that a woman's testimony wouldn't have worked for. But she goes back and she tells the village. Because Jesus was there, because he was listening, because he didn't put her off, the disciples came and tried to get in the middle of the conversation. Hey, you need to eat. It's time to eat. And Jesus said, hey, I'm actually doing what my food is right now. I'm having a conversation with a person about life and about who they are and about who I am and about what God is like. You know, we can't have those conversations if we're not willing to welcome the stranger. You can't have those conversations if you're not willing to enter into a conversation with someone who's different than you. And one of the reasons that I told you that when I went up to that counter and I sat down and the guy that was sitting two stools away from me didn't look like me is because I noticed. I noticed. Because we do notice. And it's not a problem, it's that we do. The problem is when we go, okay, I'm out. You know, it's like he moves over and I take off, right? It would have cost me a lunch if I had done that. Jesus is here in this moment, and she's got a lot of questions and a lot of doubts. And Jesus welcomed people with doubts and questions, fears. He welcomed people who were broken. Think about the people who came into Jesus' life: prostitutes, tax collectors, sinners, lepers, the outcast, the unclean. Think about the woman with the issue of blood. Here's a woman who's unclean. And it's a crazy situation. If she touches Jesus, he becomes unclean. It's a 6-day journey back to the temple to go through the temple cleansing process. But Jesus is in those moments. And I want to invite you to think about how you can be in those moments. The last story that I want to think about is Jesus at the tomb of Lazarus in John chapter 11. You know this text as well. It's such a quirky story. It says, now a certain man was ill, John chapter 11, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. And it was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sister sent him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. It's for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Doesn't sound like the thing to do. I care so much for them, I'm going to hang out here till he dies. Okay, well, we know he had a plan. We know he had something going on. But he doesn't stay gone, does he? Jesus steps out there and he moves up to where Lazarus is and where he's already died, and now he's been buried. And in chapter 11, verse 20, so when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, he will give to you. And so we have this moment where Jesus steps into this really challenging, sorrowful moment. So the text in John chapter 11, verse 35, Jesus wept. He wept with them. And you've heard this story 1,000 times probably. The odd thing about Jesus weeping with them is that he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead. Why is he weeping? I can't think of another reason other than that he actually was in sorrow because they were in sorrow and he entered into it with them. Right? That moment where he sees them and he hears them and he understands their hurt and he understands that they're hurt because of him in some way. If you'd have been here earlier, this wouldn't have happened. And so Jesus enters into this moment, this deep moment of sorrow with another person, other persons. He sees them and he hears them and it cuts to his heart and this compassion. It was overwhelming him and he wept, even though he knew he was going to solve this problem for them. And so we see Jesus in these places of authenticity. We see him at the party. We see Jesus in the conversation with the person who's very different and who isn't acceptable and who has all kinds of questions and doubts. And we see Jesus at this funeral, at this moment of grief. The only people that we find Jesus rebuking in Scripture are the people who aren't authentic in these moments. In Matthew chapter 7, he called a person a hypocrite who spent so much time judging someone because they had a splinter in their eye, they couldn't see the log in their own. Jesus says, don't judge until you've taken care of your own stuff. I think what he means is this. If you have a log in your eye, that's a pretty big thing to take care of. That's not a one-time fix it. He's saying, take a look in the mirror first. That's where you start. The mirror's where you start. The people that Jesus struggled with were the people who couldn't welcome those who were broken. And he says this over and over. If this guy knew that these people were sinners and tax gatherers, why would he be with them? And he said, hey, it's not the well who need a doctor, it's the sick. And so it's important for us to examine ourselves. If we want to have a culture that's authentic, we have to examine ourselves and ask ourselves the question, are we willing to enter into the lives of people in whatever stage we find them? Because people are messy. You found that out probably. I've been in this work for quite a long time, and I've just found out that everyone's messy. I actually assume it. And I don't mean to make you uptight, but if you come to see me for any reason, I make an assumption that you're messy. Because I'm messy. I'm probably worse than some of you, but we're all messy. We just make that assumption when people come to us. If we expect people only to come to us in conversation when they got their lives all sorted, we're going to be really confused. People's lives are messy, and our life is messy. And so we have to make space for authenticity. We have to create the space for authenticity. And making space for authenticity means that we learn to make a place for people to share their real stories without judgment. And this is a rare place to find. Do you have people in your life that you can share your story with without judgment? If MLCC is going to be a place where we are engaged in authentic, life-giving relationship, then it's going to require three things. Here are the three things that it's going to require. The first thing is that we need to create safe space as human persons where other human persons can tell their real stories. You have to be a person to whom someone else can tell their real story. And you can listen to it. I heard this a couple of weeks ago in a little conference I was at. Healing happens in the presence of non-freaked out, attentive others. I love this, right? Healing happens in the presence of non-freaked out, attentive others. I think one of the interesting things about the job that I've gotten to do over these years is when people come to me and they think they're going to tell me something that's just out of this world, like I'm not going to be able to believe it. And then they'll tell me, and then I think, oh, you have no idea. Like there's so many better stories than this one. Right? I mean, there's lots of stuff that goes on. And we need to be folks who can sit in the presence of people telling us stories and be able to be attentive to them and not to freak out and not to lose our mind about the fact that people are going through really, really challenging things. We must become people who welcome others in whatever state they come to us. Back to Brene Brown a little bit. She says this, if we can share our story with someone who responds with empathy and understanding, shame can't survive. That's a petri dish shame can't live in. If you can tell your story to people who don't cast you out, who can listen to you with empathy and understanding, then shame can't survive. And shame is really destructive. And when shame holds us, it's really difficult for us to be living the full life that God intends for us. So you have to be a person. If you want others to be authentic with you, you have to be a person who can hear their story and not lose your mind about it. We got to be people who can hold space. Let me just tell you for a minute about what holding space is. Have you heard that term, holding space? Here's what it means to hold space. It means to be with other people and not have to have control of the conversation in a lot of ways, right? I'm going to give you a list of some things that holding space means, and you can write it down if you want. I'll try to be slow enough about it. Or you can go back and listen to the sermon and the slide will show up. To be with someone without judgment, that's holding space. To be with someone without judgment. Let me just invite you to think about this for a second. It doesn't mean that what they're telling you might not be something that needs to be sorted out. There might be something broken that needs to be fixed. But it's to be with somebody without judgment. It's to donate your ears and heart without wanting anything back. How often do we listen to get something that we want or to get something done that we want done? To donate your ears and your heart without wanting anything back. It's to practice empathy and compassion. That's a pretty simple one. To practice empathy and compassion is to hold space for someone else. It's to accept someone's truth no matter what they are. To accept someone's truth no matter what they are. When you hear another person's story, their behavior makes sense. When you hear another person's story, their behavior makes sense. But we have to get to a place where we can hear the story. It's to allow and accept people. I have tried to be really, really careful with this part of my language. There have been times over the years that my sons, all of whom have done things that, like if I could have chosen, let's say, I might have chosen differently, right? But each of my boys at some point in their life has looked at me and said, Dad, I know you're disappointed in me. I have actually tried to stop that conversation every time. I'm not the best parent. I'm not trying to brag about this. I'm just saying I have tried to stop that conversation every time and say very specifically to them, very specifically, I am not disappointed in you. I would have liked for you to make a different decision here, but I'm not disappointed in you. There's never been a moment for me, I can tell you this genuinely, there's never been a moment for me when I've thought, man, I wish I had someone else's kids. I just have never had that moment. But to be able to hear a story, to be able to welcome someone, to accept them in the midst of their own life and their own falling down and getting up and falling down and getting up. To hold space is to embrace with two hands rather than pointing a finger. It's to embrace instead of to point out everything. It's to hold space. It's to be with others. It's to put your needs and opinions aside and allow someone to just be herself or himself. It doesn't mean we don't help people get better. It doesn't mean we don't help people move along. But we've got to be able to do that. And so the first thing that is required for authenticity is that we become a place where people can be authentic. We create an environment. We become a person who can hold space with others. The second thing is we have to take a risk and trust others and tell our real stories. I know this is a little bit frightening for some. We have to allow ourselves, though, to be vulnerable and authentic. We can't tell our story if we don't let ourselves be a little bit vulnerable. Only one more time with Brene Brown, but it's good, so I got to give it to you. Owning our story can be hard, but not nearly as difficult as spending our lives running from it. Embracing our vulnerabilities is risky, but not nearly as dangerous as giving up on love and belonging and joy, the experiences that make us the most vulnerable. Only when we are brave enough to explore the darkness will we discover the infinite power of the light. If you want to live in authentic, life-giving relationships, you have to risk. There isn't another way. You know, you've seen that game. It's kind of a new thing probably in the last 4 or 5 years where the big blow-up ball, you get inside of it and you play soccer. Have you seen that? It's like, and you run and bump into each other and, you just can't hardly get hurt. That's not what life is really like. There's risk. There's risk involved. You cannot have real, vulnerable, authentic, life-giving relationships without risk. And so, if that's uncomfortable for you, I'm not trying to be uncomfortable. I'm just trying to tell you what the situation actually is. You cannot be in really authentic, life-giving relationships without risk. And so you have to find a place for that. And so where are those places? It may not be here. Maybe not in this group, right? It may not even be in a life group of 10 or 12 people. Maybe it's with 2 or 3 people. Where are you going to find it? Everyone needs it. You have to be in some place in your life where you can tell your real story, where people will hear your real story, and they will hold space for you in the midst of your real story. That is really important. You cannot have authentic, life-giving relationships without this. It just doesn't exist. There's no shortcut to it. There's no way out of it. That's what it looks like. And so those are the things we have to have. We have to be people who hold space, and then we have to be people who are vulnerable, and then we have to find a place where we can be vulnerable. Where is that place for you? Maybe it isn't a life group. Maybe it's a smaller group than that. Maybe it's 1 or 2 people. Maybe it's one other person. If you don't have one other person you do life with, and your spouse hopefully is in that category, right? But there are times when you might need to talk about things, and maybe your spouse isn't going to be the best person for that. There are times like that. So you got to find people. Who are your people? Who are your people? You don't get to have the full life that Jesus intends without this kind of life. This authentic, life-giving relationship is rooted in honesty and vulnerability and reality. And so it takes some work. It takes some work to be the kind of person others can talk to, and it takes some work to be the kind of person who can speak when you need to speak. One of the things that I read from Tim Keller that has so captured me is this quote. It's from The Meaning of Marriage, which is his book on marriage, which I think may be the best book I've ever read on marriage. This is what he says in the book. He says this, for one thing, which I love, that marriage is the ultimate act of welcoming a stranger. Marriage is the ultimate act of welcoming a stranger. What does he mean by this? You're always changing. It's interesting for Sean and me. We're in this place where our boys have all moved away now. None of them live in town. It's just like there's a lot of nights, right, where we like just look at each other and she reads and I watch Netflix, and we're trying to figure it out last week or 2 weeks ago. She said, we can't just come home and eat dinner and then just go lay on our bed and read and watch Netflix and not talk to each other. We should go out for dinner. I said, okay, let's go. So we went out for dinner. We got home about 7:30. We went up to our bed. She read and I watched Netflix. I'm not making that up, and I'm not all that proud of it either. It's like we're literally looking at each other now at this stage of our life and saying, we have to figure this out because they're off. They're not missing us. I hate that. They are not missing us. Like you call up, yeah, Dad, I got to go. The Cats in the Cradle thing. I heard that song. I had to turn that right off. But Tim Keller says this about love. He says, to be loved but not known is comforting but superficial. Think about that line for just a second. To be loved but not known, it's comforting, but it's superficial. You're never quite sure. To be known and not loved is our greatest fear. This is why we tend not to be vulnerable. We're not sure what's going to happen if we tell people who we really are. If we pull the mask down, will they love the face that's behind it as much as they love the mask? But to be fully known and truly loved is, well, a lot like being loved by God. It is what we need more than anything. MLCC is at its best when we are engaged in authentic, life-giving relationships, and that takes being a person that can be trusted. It takes being vulnerable when it's uncomfortable, and it takes finding a place where you can be welcomed. I hope that you find all of those things, because that's where abundant life lives.